Hello, my name is Reverend Gregory Holston, and welcome to Just Nation, a show about faith, justice, and race in the city of Philadelphia and beyond. And we're excited here today to have our guests with us as we talk about this very important program around the life and times of Martin Luther King Jr., or what we're saying, the life of his part of his life that deals with his more radical ideas and principles. And so our guests here are going to share with us their perspectives on this. And we hope that there's power in the knowledge and the learning that can come through this that can move us to the kind of action that King was all about. Again, I'm here with my co-host, Nia Holston.
All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited for this conversation because I think
You're always excited.
Sure, we'll go with that. But I'm particularly excited, shall I say, for this conversation because I think, given that we are in this month of celebrating Dr. King, and there have been specific efforts to sanitize, misrepresent, and claim a narrative that is completely false about who Martin Luther King was and what he represented and what his ideals and his beliefs were. And I think that it's critically important for us to remember his life, to remember his legacy, and to remember the words that he left us with, and the calls to action that he gave us, that we still need to carry through today.
Yes.
So I'm incredibly
particularly in this month, the month of his assassination, that we think about all of what he meant.
Yes.
And particularly in the last 2 years of his life, where people don't really know fully the policies and the ideas that he was beginning to shift on. And that some things are more celebrated from what he said in 1963 compared to what he was saying in 1966, 67, and 68. So we're excited to be able to talk about all of that today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have some wonderful guests with us today that we're really excited to be able to get into this conversation with. So why don't we start with some introductions? So I'm going to start to my right with Brittany Alston, who is the executive director of the Philly Black Worker Project. And Brittany, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you to this conversation?
Sure. Well, first, thank you both for the invitation to be here. My name is Brittany Alston. I'm the executive director of the Philly Black Worker Project. And we're a worker center in the city that supports Black workers, overwhelmingly workers who are formerly incarcerated, who work in the temp industry, or what we call more generally the contingent workforce, to fight for dignity and respect both on their jobs and in their communities. And so I think this is a really important conversation because we know that the last moments of Dr. King's life were actually on strike lines, right? And having conversations about the importance of dignity and respect at work. And he proclaimed very boldly that all labor has dignity. And so I think it's a really important conversation for us to connect the beliefs and words of Dr. King to the labor movement and also his critiques that I think are still really, really resonant today of what is needed from the labor movement and what we need to do to be holistically representing the interests of Black workers.
That's wonderful. And to my left?
Yes. I'm Timothy Welbeck. I'm the director for the Center of Anti-Racism at Temple University. And one of the things that brings me here tonight is just how King is one of the foremost anti-racists. And he helped to shape our understanding of not only what racism is, but how it manifests, particularly in unique ways against our people, but particularly towards the latter part of his life, he began to take on a more global view of that. And as a consequence of that, too, his direct action campaigns and the like also, I think, are informative for how we can continue his legacy, both of word and action.
And how does that work fit in with your work at the Anti-Racism Center?
Well, so that's a great question. So at the Center for Anti-Racism, we say we do our work in 3 pillars: scholarship, public education, and community engagement. So with scholarship, we want to do the traditional work of academic studies, essays, journal articles, things like that. With public education, we want to make that information more accessible to everyday people, because sometimes the key insights from what academics do get lost, or are housed only in academia.
Yes.
And then lastly, with community engagement, we want to bring informed solutions to our community first, North Philadelphia, and then abroad. And so how King factors into that, in a lot of ways, we can learn both from his writings, his advocacy, and the campaigns that he was leading, both in terms of advocacy that we can continue, and then also direct actions that we could potentially engage in now. And just particularly, even as Brittany was saying, the lasting part of his legacy, the time in which he was assassinated, was fighting for the dignity of workers, and just looking at his anti-capitalist rhetoric, the dignity of work, and how that can factor into some of the broader work that we're doing.
Excellent, excellent. We want to come back to many of the points you said. And to my further left.
Peace. My name is Ishmael Jimenez. I am an educator here in Philadelphia for over a decade now. Also side hustle at a university. I'm not going to say his name. But beyond that, for me, King as an educator always represented kind of the miseducation that our children get about the legacy, which ultimately leads to kind of associating King with like suits, and that's the only way you can march, or he's peaceful, and the binary that they put with Malcolm. And so as an educator, when you actually show students King's actual words, what he actually advocated towards the end of his life, it opens their eyes and be like, oh, why don't we learn about this? Why is this left out? And then I'll be like, well, who built that statue that's in DC? Who funded that statue in DC? And then you just get into the deeper conversations about what he meant by the giant triplets of materialism, racism, and militarism. So pertinent today, so relevant today. And even his stance against the Vietnam War. We don't have an anti-war movement currently right now. And King was at the forefront of that, so much so that he almost, sacrificed himself, not just for our people, but for people around the world, for our humanity.
Wow, there's a lot there in all of what you said. So I guess if we'll start with that first question, and you all touched on it to some degree. Was King a radical? You might, in doing that, you might define what a radical is. Brittany, you want to start?
Sure. I would say yes. I would say that King was a radical, and I would also argue that even in some of his earliest writings, he was anti-capitalist, you know what I mean? And I think there is a way that we see the maturation of his political imagination and development over time. But I think it is also true that he had very, I was sharing earlier that I was reading some of the letters that he was writing to Coretta, and he said, I guess you may say that I have a socialist tendency, right? That's not exactly what he said, but that is what he's saying. And I think that even if he were not to declare himself a socialist, right? Or we hear him saying what he wanted the vision for our people to be, and we know that that is a radically different political or freedom dream than what was presented in this current version of a capitalist society. And so I think that a radical, in my opinion, which is a great question, I've never actually been asked this question before, but I would say it is somebody who is deeply against all forms of oppression and in search of a system and structural shift that makes way for the freedom of all of our people. And so if that is true, then I think that we have to say that King is a radical. And I read some amazing articles on a thesis that King was also potentially a Pan-Africanist, right? And how he talks about the independence of Ghana and Kwame and Nkrumah, and who has lots of Philadelphia roots, right? And so I think that I think that he was a beautiful example of a radical, and I think there is a way that we might think of radicalism almost as something that does not include love. And there's this way that I think King embodied love through his radicalism that was really beautiful and touching and important for us to remember in moments where there's so much hate.
Well, definitely, and I co-sign everything you just said.
Yeah.
Like when I think of radicals, like getting to the root of it, right? And really kind of like objecting to it, but not in a passive way. Like you're actively going against what exists. And I think King's life speaks of that. You know, many people don't know, when he was assassinated, only 40% of African Americans had a favorable opinion of Martin Luther King. He was railroaded as a communist, even starting from the Montgomery bus boycott. And one thing we cannot forget, he was only 39 when he was assassinated. So I think it really speaks to his own kind of intellectual honesty, because if you read his last book, the one that was published before he passed away, which I didn't even learn about until.
You know what the title of that book was?
Where Do We Go From Here?
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and he's wrestling with Black power.
Yes.
He's wrestling with the futility of trying to convince, you know, the white moderates, something he even talked about in the Birmingham jail letter. And I think that, you know, King as a radical, he was radical because he was Black in America, and he was not going to allow himself to be otherized in the sense of dehumanized. And he didn't want his folks dehumanized no more. And he dedicated his life from a young child to making sure that he was combating that. When you read some of his writings, he talks about his first experience dealing with racism, going to the shoe store when he was a child, and how his parents had to explain to him because they sheltered him so much in their community. And I think that that sense of injustice, that sense of kind of like, I'm going to fight back against this because it's my duty, it's my life's duty. Not, you know, even in his last speech, you know, I want to live a long life. Everybody wants longevity, you know, is a place. But he also recognized there was a higher calling and a duty to do. And, you know, by definition, in a white supremacist society, that is radical, because you want to uproot that, because you can't be human, others can't be human if that's in existence.
Professor Timothy, they have really laid this out pretty well. I'm wondering, I'm accenting the professor part of it because I want to hear the professorial point of view on this point.
I think my colleagues have done an excellent job laying out what made King radical, and just in that he was a usurper of structures. And ultimately, I think some of the ways that are key to looking at that too is he was assassinated. He was a pariah in the last year of his life. He was a subject of government surveillance. He was constantly facing the brunt of police brutality. And so when you look at the way that the system conspired against him to stop his efforts, it shows that there was something radical about the way he challenged the systems that hold up our society. And so whether it's his anti-imperialist take, whether it's his anti-capitalist take, whether it was, like Ishmael said, I'm sorry.
It's all good.
Oh my
it's all good, homie.
My goodness.
Maybe I get some points for that.
Maybe that'll get them legal. As Ishmael mentioned too, just the way he fought for the dignity of Black people. That in and of itself was a radical thing to do, particularly at the time in which he did it, because for the entirety of our time in this of Africans in America, we have fought for our dignity and fought against our oppression, but we were still expected to acquiesce to the system itself, to assimilate into the cultural norms and mores. And so him being one of the leaders in that moment to say no more. And so that is radical in and of itself. I mean, so to look at the system as it was and say, we're going to do something about this. We don't have to allow Jim Crow to live another generation. We can defeather it in our generation. That in and of itself is radical, to not accept the reality that was handed to them, but to lead towards what he talked about, beloved community.
And particularly, I think the call for us as Black people, right, to want to aspire to more than a society, in a Jim Crow society in which we are accepted, right?
Exactly.
Like the goal is not assimilation. The goal is, for lack of a better word, a radical restructuring of society and overturning oppression in its many forms. And so, you know, that legacy particularly sticks with me as we think about on all the ways in which some Black people have been allowed to progress through society. in a way, in a tokenism that presents itself in sort of a way to say, well, if they have it, if they can do it, everybody else can do it. And so there's nothing wrong with the system. And we think of even our first Black president, we think of that, what that meant. And so I'm excited as we get further into this conversation to talk about not just Dr. King's calls for uprooting oppression in all its forms, but also the calls that he has that are radical for our own communities as well.
Yes. So we take it that everybody said he's a radical.
Yes.
And you all laid out some radical portions of what made him a radical. You know, his just being against the the white supremacist system in this country, and actively fighting against it. To be against the capitalist system, I don't think people really recognize King, and then some have still think it as almost like a slur, that he really was anti-capitalist.
Well, Jay-Z said capitalism is a slur, so, you know.
Right.
You know.
And capitalists are the new N-words.
If you have a real view of putting people over profits, that's anti-capitalist.
And it's also radical.
Yes.
Right.
And I mean, I think, you know, something that really stood out to me is the way in which he proposed some of those things happening. He wasn't just like, we should fund education, we should fund, you know, housing, we should have a UBI, which he suggested. He was like, actually, we should defund the militarist state in order to then transfer those funds, which now we use as like an invest-divest framework in our organizing. But I mean, the Freedom Plan is an example of an invest-divest framework where we are literally saying we want to defund the military, you know, the military, we want to defund war and put that into the things that benefit us. I think that that is a very radical policy to be fighting
as
for.
radical as it was, so that whole piece from his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he talks about the three evils, three triplets.
Triplets.
You know, militarism, you know, economic oppression, and racism as being the three evils that manifest itself in this country. Just talk about that analysis and what you think, how that is radical, and even applying it to what we see today. Any of you want to just jump in?
Well, just quickly, they all feed off of each other. I think that's,
Exactly, yes.
you know, you really can't have one without the others, and so you have to have an analysis of all of those different factors. Materialism, how it impacts our desire to have more and more and more, impacts the earth, impacts our relationships in community with each other. Racism, a hierarchy of people, benefits a materialistic system, and so you have to keep people underneath or develop systems in order to make sense of why certain people need to be oppressed and other people don't need to be oppressed. And militarism being the need to defend all of that. Like, I have all this stuff and I have to defend it. And so, and you have the system of racialized oppression that again creates those hierarchies. And so, I think first it's recognizing how all of these systems are interconnected, right? And you really can't fight one, honestly, without fighting all of them. So.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes him radical too.
Yes,
he said
exactly.
that 59 years ago, and he could have said it this morning, and it would this is true. So
This is true. More true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to see it from that far off and say that this is the direction that we are heading is it really captures what he was talking about in so many different ways, but particularly when you look at a nation that made commodities out of people, turned people into merchandise. So it makes sense that there's this interconnected analysis of racism, extreme materialism, as he called it, and that address, and militarism. And so, like you said, you need the militarism to defend all these other systemic injustices and structural imbalances that you've created. And there's this nexus between the racism and the extreme materialism, in part because you create this imbalance of the haves and the have-nots, which goes along this racial hierarchy that we have. So you got this stratification where you put black at the bottom and white at the top. And so everyone's jockeying for an opportunity to get that. And I would say his critique is particularly germane now when you look at particularly the way in which we're even advancing towards AI. Look at the devastation that it's having on the planet, the demands that it puts on energy, the demands that it puts on water, the way it dehumanizes people, is pushing people out of opportunities for work or a livable wage and things like that. And so much of it is distilling down to a sense of property control and also, again, the stratification. So,
and no questioning whether we should do this.
Yes, the ethical concerns went out the window.
Right. And just to be clear, just so for folks working at home, when Professor Welbeck talks about the environmental impacts of AI, it's been said that one query in ChatGPT takes about a bottle of water of energy to produce. So it is quite a bit. You can imagine all of the queries that you may have done in ChatGPT and how much energy that is taking to produce those results, to call all those results from all corners of the internet and distill them into one answer.
It is why even 3 Mile Island, the nuclear plant, they're talking about reopening it just to gather the energy for AI. Even though it's toxic, it's poison. So the desperation for energy, the desperation for the continue to increase the materialism, the devaluing of human beings and human life, it just continues nonstop now without any real critique. Is this the kind of life we want to have? And I'm diverting a little bit, but in the discussion we had in Philadelphia around Chinatown, we kept coming back to people over profits, that we should want people over profits. Why would a little Chinatown be valuable enough to us compared to an arena? When I asked the question of some leaders, why you support this, they kept saying $1.3 billion, $1.3 billion. But what about the people who have lived there for 150 years and have invested their lives in the community? Don't they have value? But they only could see the number. They couldn't see the value of the people. And whether it's Chinatown or other parts of Philadelphia where development is happening, constantly we're seeing profits put over people. And that is directly against what Martin Luther King really was saying for all of his life, but particularly the last years of his life. And yes, it is anti-capitalist. But we have a lot of things in this country that are anti-capitalist that we now accept as needed, like Social Security, like Medicare, like Medicaid.
Some of us accept. Some of us accept.
I mean, but I think this is also, to me,
I had to find that in.
I think it's also important though, because this was part of what he has highlighted in his legacy. It is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, right?
Rugged individualism.
Right, and so I think that we know that we have a robust public infrastructure for the military. We have a robust public infrastructure, you know what I mean, to create tax credits that allow developers to not pay the taxes necessary to fund our school district or our budgets. We have robust infrastructure, public infrastructure, to subsidize privatization of our goods and services. And so we know that the infrastructure exists. It's just a matter of who it's for, and us being very honest about a critique that shifts and redistributes how we think about the public infrastructure, and I think there's lots of critiques about what the public infrastructure should be or if it should be, but I think that it isn't because there is no public investment. It's just, what is that public investment?
And the idea of public investment is socialism.
Yes.
Pure capitalism does not have a public sector. So we get with all these labels that they use to kind of make us the boogeyman. Oh my God, it's socialism. When we have so many, as you just said, socialist things that are regularly done in our country.
Listen, $950 million of our city budget goes to prisons and to our police district. It isn't that we are unwilling to spend the money.
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
spend the money. You know what I mean? We spend the money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to get back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the importance of.
Sorry, I digressed a little bit.
No, it's okay. It's the importance of people to this equation and how it's so, vital for us to take care of each other. And what capitalism doesn't do is precisely that, right? It doesn't allow for us to see the humanity and other people. And one of the things that I've been really troubled by in this particular age is the ways in which we're just so committed to not doing that. This country elected a president who made it very clear that he does not care about people who are undocumented. It does not care about people who are experiencing harm. Does not care about even the middling systems that we had to preserve civil rights, right? And so that factor, we need that return to love. We need that return to the care for our communities beyond just ourselves, beyond just our families.
Just to veggie back off of that, because that immediately makes me think of what King's statue, who made that funding, and I mentioned that earlier. We have J.P. Morgan, the largest bank in the world. We got Boeing, one of the largest military contractors, and Walmart, biggest contributor to extreme materialism.
Look like Martin Luther King.
I'm cracking up.
I had
All that money.
Listen, I was an intern at the White House when they unveiled that, and I can remember sitting honestly with Dick Gregory, looking at that monument.
I would love to have heard what he said.
Minding his business. I feel like everybody was so interested in this, and Dick Gregory was on the side minding his business for real.
and that speaks to it, right?
Yeah.
But like it even speaks to us now, where these ideas or the iconography has been co-opted.
Yeah.
Co-opted in the way where cosigns say our president-elect represents America. When he was running for election, I'm like, that's America. That's really what America is, without the flowers, without the makeup.
Yeah.
And when we talk about
Not without the makeup.
well, yeah.
With the bad makeup.
That is.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
We're going to move on because we don't want to scare people.
No, but like, think about that. Like,
Yeah.
I think King, and I always said this to my students, King fought for all people.
Yeah.
When we talk about the American values in which they tell us we stand for, or the mythology of what we should stand for in this modern age and want to pump to our children, King actually did. And he got killed for that.
Yes, he did.
And even towards the end of his life, he's like, we need to have a revolution of values. Not just a little bit, but like the whole core needs to be flipped out. And I think at the end of his life, he was tired. Because he's starting to realize, like, is this just a futility? Like, all these people who claim to be my friends and supporters, if they really understood what I was talking about, they would understand the logical connection between being against war and being against Jim Crow and fighting for equal access in the North. Like, those things are all interconnected.
All interconnected. And Timothy, you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And what I would say, his last public address in Mason Temple, I think captures the sum total of what we're talking about. I would encourage all of your viewers to watch that before we gather together. I watch it at least once a year, just because it fully encapsulates his worldview, his advocacy, and so much of the various components of what we're talking about are there. Even when Ishmael was talking about how like America is this facade, he talked about all we want is America to be true to what it says on paper.
Yeah.
That's what he said, and that's ultimately what he was what he was aiming for. And so when you look at all of these divergent things, I think the other thing to consider too is just that had he not been assassinated, I think we would have continued to see the spiral that he had outside of people's outside of public favor, but just because he was already a pariah at that juncture, and people were growing tired of the rhetoric, like, when is enough enough? And we've already seen that in real time, right? So we're 5 years just about removed from the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and and George Floyd. And with that, we made this collective commitment as a nation. We did this racial reckoning. We did all the fanfare in the summer of 2020.
Book clubs.
The book clubs.
The black
the
squares.
statements, the black squares.
The die-ins.
Announcements from corporations.
All the-
We are
Aunt Jemima
anti-racist.
gone.
Auntie Mama gone.
Yes,
Uncle
master's
Ben.
bedrooms are now what
Primaries.
Yes,
Primaries.
so all of these performative gestures, and we saw just how quickly our nation regressed. Within that, I mean, the regression began that fall with the attacks against critical race theory, and then the weaponization and misuse of the term woke, and now there's the attacks against DEI. And so I say that to say, in the same way that we see the march towards racial equity reviled in our current day, that's what King was experiencing in an exacerbated way, particularly when he started making some of these other connections. And when he was saying that a universal basic income or dignity of work is not just a racial issue, it's a human issue. And when he started talking about America expanding its empire is a threat to humanity, that's what makes him radical. And so, and it's for that it cost him his life. And so society wasn't prepared to hear it then, it's not prepared to hear it now. And so that's the perpetual fight, that can we get past this fatigue and the opposition from any progress perceived or actual.
So a couple of things there that you just brought up was beautifully. First of all, that his answer for the three triplets, the evil's triplets, were revolutionary of our values.
Yes.
To change our values. And one of the values he was to change was how we did economics. So the guaranteed income, which he was not the first one to bring this up. Many people had brought it up before. But he linked it to the solution, one of the solutions, not the solution, one of the solutions to the three evils. And that would be a first step, just saying to every American, we will always provide enough for you to eat, for you to have shelter, for you to have life. Was it life and the pursuit of happiness?
That's what it says. That's what the document
Yeah,
says.
that's something like
That's what it
Right
said.
across
the
the street.
250th anniversary is coming
Right.
up next year.
It
so
is.
something like that.
And all we want you to do is to be true to what you said on paper. That's really what he was saying. And that's what he said. He said, if I lived in another place, if I lived in communist Russia, if I lived in communist China, I wouldn't have these expectations. But I have these expectations because I live in America, and you told
wrote
me
it
this
down.
is what you value.
Yeah.
Y'all need to go
more healthcare.
Yes, go back and watch that speech. I mean, I can't say it better than he can.
But it's easier to
worth-
lie than to give up stuff, right?
Exactly. It's easier to lie than give up stuff, and people would prefer the myth over the reality.
You know, and I think about this often because as an organizer, I have to believe that's not true, right? Like there is something in me that has to believe that's not true. And I think one of the things that King does really well, he actually doesn't get wrapped up in the name of a particular political tendency,
Yes.
right? He talks really beautiful about the philosophy. I think Ella Baker is another great example of somebody, right, who did the work as compared to she didn't claim to be a black Marxist or you know what I mean, whether or not they were at any point card-carrying communists. But like, I think they didn't always need that label to do the work. And I think that there is a way in which, you know, the tendencies inform our praxis. And I really believe that these tendencies inform our praxis, but the policies and the issues are what people care about. And so if we are sometimes able to navigate and build meaningful relationships with people about their self-interest and the things that they care about, we see people who thought they were, you know, very conservative be the primary leaders of a union fight, right? Well, you would have talked to them 6 months before and you would have thought they were anti-union. We see people who thought that they were not able to be in the same room as queer people standing next to trans folks to fight for X, Y, and Z. And so I do think that there is this way that we've become so dedicated to the tendency or the political party that we aren't actually honing in and giving people the opportunity to show us if they care more about the issue. And we know we know, I think there's been a decent amount of research to say people support Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
People support
Yes.
these things, right? And so there's a gap between how we're organizing people and what we're saying people's values are. And to me, that is where I'm most interested. What are the organizing fundamentals and the organizing infrastructures that need to exist to bridge that gap?
Absolutely.
And it is the language we use without the theory. I think phrases like people over profits.
And that is the theory.
Yeah, it is the theory. Yes,
You know what I
that's right.
mean?
It is the theory.
That is the
Exactly, that's
theory.
the
That is the theory. But it's said so simply. Yeah, people should be before profits.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
And you ain't got to be whatever philosophy or that you think you might have to see people over profits.
Yeah.
As and that is the radical change in values that King wants to see.
Yeah. And the
So-
Black radical tradition.
And it's finding
Yep.
phrases like that that explain this path, this radical change in values that King has, and that many of us here are figuring out how
Yeah.
to share today.
Yeah.
Those kind of simple pieces that lead people into a revolution of their own values.
So I guess I have a question. What are some of the barriers and roadblocks to this radical vision? And they can be individual roadblocks. They can be, sort of more globalized community roadblocks. I'll start with one that, I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Maybe it makes me feel like an old millennial, like shaking my fist at the door. But it's social
I'm the
media.
old father shaking this.
Yeah, well, you just. I'm not gonna go there
It's
on
all right.
TV.
It's all right.
Not on TV.
I can get you later for that.
But I think about social media and its impacts that it's had on our brain development, on what we spend our time on what we engage with. Literally, the mechanics of it, just scrolling through, and what that does to our brains over time. What we're spending our time actually watching on there, and some of the content is very good, but some of it is very materialistic, like just specifically designed to get us to spend as much money as possible on things that we don't need.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
the more you become ingratiated and concerned with that, primarily, the easier it is to move away from a radical vision. So I think we are dealing in some ways with much more difficult and sinister villains or roadblocks in this day and age.
I think the word insidious.
Insidious, yeah.
Just creeps in
It
to
does.
how you're living. That your thinking is transformed in ways that you didn't even intend, just by the subtleties of social media.
Yeah. But that's just me shaking my fist. So.
I mean, I feel like I ride for Gen Z real hard, even though I'm definitely an older millennial at this point. But I feel like technology is what we pour into it. And I think there's this really beautiful piece that I always love to read by Che Guevara that's like Socialism in the Man. And there's a part of it where he talks about what it would mean to create art in an anti-capitalist system. And it's him sort of dreaming up what a different Cuba would look like. And I think that that's true of most of the technologies. The algorithms are not some omniscient force. It's people, right, creating algorithms that are in capitalist systems. And so I think that like part of what we see with social media is a result of a deeply individualistic society that is dedicated to consumerism.
But does it exacerbate it? Is my
Does it
question.
magnify?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that it's easy to make social media the thing, right? But let's take social media away. Nothing else changes about our society. You know what I mean? We're still intensely atomized. We're still intensely individualized. And I think when we look at workers, I can just say there is no shop floor for app-based work, right? There is no shop floor for temp workers who only get one shift at a particular shop a week. I don't know what your life was like with your parents, but did you know their coworkers? Were you ever in community with these people, right? There's all of these different communal spaces that existed that have, I think, been intentionally broken down, and that creates the deep distrust that prevents us from organizing even when we disagree.
And so to get that revolution of our values, there has to be spaces
That we
allow
care.
for the organizing
Yeah.
and communication
Yeah.
to transform those values.
Yes.
So how do we take what King said is the solution, a radical change of values, solutions like guaranteed income, people over profits, as a way of saying it. How do we organize in a way to build those values into this new generation, as you said, that is inundated with the values of individualism and capitalism and all of the social media? How do we do that?
Right.
Yeah. I was about to say.
I thought you were going to give me the answer.
Like you have all. I was about to say, and I don't want to be super cynical or
Yeah.
pessimistic, right? But I take the subway in Philadelphia to work every day, home and back. And the situation I think we're facing is much more dire than what King was talking about. I think towards the end of his life when he said, if we don't change direction, we're going to be drugged down the long, dark corridor of desperation and despair. And then he got killed. And I think that we see that, unfortunately, too much. So like the cynic in me is saying that's the reality, right? The hope, I think, comes from recognizing that we have to admit that. And I think sometimes we're not admitting that reality right now, what we're facing. And we're also dealing with conceptual incarceration, where we're thinking, like we have youth that think, oh, I'm on social media talking this smack all day, I'm organizing.
Right.
That's not organizing.
For sure.
Do you know who your neighbor is? Do you know?
Yeah.
So like, I think that this kind of situation now, there's more mirages and camouflages, where people think that they're actually making something happen. When I look, and I was listening, overhearing the youth on the subway the other day, and while a dude on the corner, not in the corner, but in the subway looking in the mirror, putting a heroin needle in the back of his neck, it reminds me how empty this type of situation is. And I think King recognized that. I think King was warning us, and I think America didn't heed the call. If anything, America doubled down.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
Eventually elected Reagan.
Yeah.
And then we in the situation we find ourselves in, where even our Democratic candidates were capitulating to corporate interests, to militarism,
And
to
still doing it.
it. So like we look around and it's like, you know, we do, like folks, like young folks, like why should I vote? It doesn't matter. They peep game a little bit, and instead of saying, you know, you right, man, like this John is kind of messed up, and why is that? We tell them, oh no, man, you need to get a good job, stay, you know, follow the rules, and it's like, is that the solution? No. Is at the end of the day, just so I can have a house like Massa and be like, telling other folks that I'm Massa now and I got the same type of car? What is the ultimate goal? And I think King recognized that and really wrestled with that towards the end, because people were coming to him. Like, what's the solution? What's the solution?
Black Power movement was very critical of him, and so caused him to think and reflect in much deeper ways.
Yes.
They did, and one of the things when you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about is just the metaphor of just that you can boil a frog alive because it's going to subtly adjust to the increasing temperature. And so America doesn't realize that it's the frog that's in the pot, that's on the stove, whose temperature is gradually increasing. And so if, and as
wait a minute, who's frog here, man? Who's the frog?
We're in the same house.
Who the frog is, man?
So I would venture to say all of us are just in that, because the system that we're in is not working, and it's so inviting to chase after the semblance of the American dream, and it's the rug has been pulled out of an entire generation just in that. When you look at the prospects of home ownership, the prospects of viable employment, the prospects of securing some modicum of financial security, and that's got everyone on this hamster wheel chasing after this thing that's completely eluding them. Then you get this rugged individualism where people are not thinking about the context of their experience and how it relates to other people.
Yes.
Because if you sit people down and look and explain to them what's in front of them and what can be, people realize that we have more similarities than differences. that our values, the things that we're chasing, align more than we imagine that they do. And that's when organizing can begin. Because you said it earlier, Brittany, just in that people who thought that I can't be in a room with this person, I can't be next to this person, are now 10 toes down on the picket line fighting for the same goal. And so much of the society that we live in has divided us in this way to think about what can I get for myself. And the temperature is increasing and we're all boiling and don't realize just how close we are to a different reality when we can organize and jump out of the pot.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have I think about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And we've kind of dealt with this a little bit, but let's put the nail on the hammer on the nail. How does what would the radical king be saying now to address Trump and Trumpism? What would the radical king be doing now to address Trump and Trumpism? That's both what he would say and what would he do?
I'm never going to be able to say what King would say because King was king. But maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I will answer it this way. This is what I hope he would be saying. I think that if we assume that his political development continued, because there's a version of a lot of folks who stagnate, right? And their political imaginations are now stale. And so that's a possibility. But let's say that would never happen to him because we love him so much, right? I don't think that he would be concerned with the parties of Democrat and Republican. You know what I mean? I think we then had, we've seen people like a Fannie Lou Hamer, we've seen people dream up different political avenues and parties and structures. And I think if it were true that he lived and saw this version of this, I cannot curse on the show, but this mess that we just got out of, I don't think his answer would be to try to change the democratic institution. You know what I mean? I think that he would have evolved to the point where he's thinking about what independent parties look like and what that means and what a real critique is.
But I sort of understood the question to be, and I agree with you completely, less about the parties and more about what does it mean for in this moment to have a leader, demagogue, whatever you want to call him, in power, who is articulating a completely alternate vision of what community should look like, a completely alternate vision of what should happen in society, and so I think for me, I think he would be in direct opposition. Obviously centralized around anti-capitalism and love for the community. I think he would be strongly stating free Palestine. And I think he would.
Definitely.
I think in response to Trumpism, I think he would be very concerned about the values that we've been talking about, the values that people are holding, and encouraging all of us to embrace community.
Yes.
I do think he would push, though, for something. And that's the thing. I think that he would be looking for a vehicle, an action-oriented vehicle that would be in opposition with all of the things that you said. But what is because he was so concretely creating plans for something else, I think he would be thinking about what the solution, the structure, infrastructure would be for our movements too.
Right.
I think Trump, I agree with both of you.
Yeah.
So Nia, I agree with you in that I think King would have sharp concerns about the direction of the country to elect someone like President Trump. And just considering that George Wallace, for example, ran for president 4 times, some of which overlap with King's lifetime, and it was unsuccessful. King saw the bully in Bull Connor, and he never ascended to national office. So to have someone espousing the same type of rhetoric ascend to the nation's highest office who's woefully unqualified to do so, and all the carnage that he wreaked, with his first term, he would, I think, would be concerned about the regression of the nation to want that old thing back. And I also believe that, as you all were both speaking, one of the things I was thinking about was where would he land, because it is a paradox to think of King in the last year of his life. What would that person, if you transport him to now, what would he be thinking? And so part of me is like, would he have endorsed a candidate, even if it was not someone who was ideal, in hopes of unseating that impending tragedy? Or would he go for and try to build a viable third party? Especially because some people wanted him to run for elected office too. So I think it's hard to know. But I do know that he would have sharp critiques for the direction of the country, particularly the bigotry, the xenophobia, the overt racism. I mean, like, there were literal Nazis and neo-Nazis who were endorsing the rhetoric of the Trump campaign. So I think he would have sharp critiques around that. And he would say it much better than I just said it right now, of course.
But his last book was Where Do We Go From Here? So that's more than critique.
Yes.
That's a plan. What do we do?
Right.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is kind of thinking with all those kind of ideas, what would he be doing?
Well,
And so we got a little bit of analysis about, well, he'd be organizing an independent party. But if it was just really about a radical change of values, does he need to do a party to do that?
Yeah, that's a fair question.
when I think of King nowadays, I think he would be marginalized.
Absolutely.
I don't think we would hear about him like that on major news media. I don't know if any of y'all saw the Boondocks episode.
That's what I was thinking
when
this
King
whole time.
I was too.
All of us.
But like, I really do think like that's where it would be. I think there's people now doing the work. There are folks doing the work, but we're not. It's not going to be advocated for. You think the powers that be didn't learn? You think the powers that be haven't, have folks on their payroll who have like triple doctorates in different levels of psychology to market certain ideas to certain groups of people in order to disrupt type of anything like that happening? What made King powerful wasn't necessarily King. It was the people that followed him. And Ella Baker was super clear about that. She was even critical of King. Putting faith in one charismatic leader. What happens to the movement when that leader is gone? And I think that speaks power, number one, to the need for collective organizing and the need for that real work to happen. But I think if King was alive now, he wouldn't be. I mean, like I think some people who should be with him would be against him.
Absolutely.
And this is the sad part where we're at, and that's what I'm saying. I don't want to be the cynic, and hopefully we got some time left so we don't end on this note. But that's as an educator, as someone who's thinking constantly of like, how do you raise the level of consciousness to the point where folks actually think and wrestle with this? What we're talking, most Americans can't engage in this level of conversation around King, and we need to make sure that happens. We make sure our children are involved in this conversation. If not, we're that long dark corridor of desperation and despair. I don't know if there's a light at the end of it anymore.
So we got about 5 minutes left, and we're going to give you all an opportunity to kind of sum up. I find it interesting that one of his radical ideas, the guaranteed income, that you see billionaires talking about that. And that they're so worried about AI taking so many jobs away and be that disruptive that they want governments to put a guaranteed income in place just so all of what they're building won't be disrupted.
Pressure gauge.
Yeah, because if the widgets take all the jobs, who buys the widgets?
So that
Pressure gauge.
is pressure to release the pressure valve.
I think they know. I think that there's like the effective altruistic venture capitalists, right? I think that they understand that there's a particular balance that you must maintain in the belly of the beast to not move toward a revolutionary future. And if we are not critical of, I support a guaranteed income, and the Philly Black Worker Project is excited to launch a campaign on guaranteed income for formerly incarcerated workers next year, but like,
Excellent, excellent.
I think it is because we see that as a pathway to a conversation about reparations, not as an avenue to quell the energy of revolutionary spirits. And I do think that if the billionaire class is proposing it, then we have to be critical and thinking very carefully about what the next thing is, because it means that that's too small. If they want it too,
Yes.
then we need to be thinking bigger
Yes,
than them.
that
I love that.
Yeah.
organizing phrase. If they really want this, that what we're asking for is too small.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
You know, if they agree, I had a friend of mine recently doing a community benefits agreement. They offered $50,000. He came back with $7 million. The next day they came back with $1 million.
So you had $1 million.
So he looked at the people who were around him and said, "Let's take that $1 million." He said, "Man, if they say $1 million that quick, you know they got more money than this." Now he couldn't convince them, so they just took the $1 million. But the point is made that if billionaires are telling you guaranteed income, there's a whole lot more out there that the people can be able to get in the kind of lifestyle, the kind of the values, the kind of life we want to live. We have about 2 minutes left, so we're going to give you about 30 seconds each to kind of close up with some closing thoughts of what you think the Radical King and any ideas or thoughts you have about the Radical King. And we'll start.
So, you know, the Radical King, I think speaks to our current situation. We need to learn the lessons that he learned and build off of them. I think sometimes when we look at ancestors like King, we look at what he did and not the lessons that he learned, and we need to really build upon them. Also, I think that he also talked about that, that honesty about where we're at and that revolution of values that needs to happen, not just for the saving of America, but the saving of humanity. And that's what I take as the radical piece. So when I use Martin King's words and quote them when people are having Martin Luther King Santa Claus Day, you'd be like, King actually said things like this and disrupt the comfortability. And it comes from a long intellectual genealogy of the Black radical tradition of fighting for humanity that only happened in this country by Black folks.
Yes.
Okay, that's 30 seconds.
Okay, similarly, I would just say that the hope that King offered us is that the beloved community is worth fighting for. And I think that's what we should take from this. So it's difficult when we look at our present reality, but he also faced a bleak reality. But he also felt as though the beloved community is something that we should all collectively work and fight to achieve.
Yeah. I think organize, you know what I mean? And I think he had he wrote, he spoke, but he took direct action, and I think we need to really stand on that legacy of taking direct action and going to get what we want.
Start with love. Start with love and build on that as the root. Yeah, I'm with that.
Yeah. So his last words were, "I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight, we as a people will get to the promised land. That despite of all of that despair we're talking about, he still had hope. And is that the hope that we need to live on, that we can build a beloved community for all of us that is more powerful than the billionaires, more powerful than inequality, more powerful than militarism. It's more powerful than those things because there is a spirit greater than ourselves that is leading us on the way. Thank you so much again for being with us here on Just Nation. We'll see you again next time.
Hi, everyone. Good night.
Good night.